Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you are sitting in a quiet, modern kitchen in a city that never sleeps. The hum of the refrigerator is the only sound you hear. You hold a warm cup of tea in your hands, feeling the steam touch your face. Outside the window, the world looks peaceful. The streetlights reflect off the glass, and the trees move gently in the night wind. But somewhere, thousands of miles away, the sky is not silent. Imagine a young person in another city looking up at that same moon. But instead of peace, they hear a low, heavy sound in the distance. They see a small red light moving quickly across the stars. This is not a plane carrying travelers home. It is a machine of war. How do we get here? Why does a quiet night in one part of the world feel so different from a night in another? Let's go back in time, far back into the mists of history, before the rockets, before the angry speeches, and before the walls of silence. There was a different world. Imagine a map of the Middle East in the year 1950. The colors on the map are the same, but the spirit of the people is different. In those days, the air was filled with a strange kind of hope. New nations were being born, and old empires were fading away. People were looking for partners, not enemies. They were building roads, schools, and bridges. In the sun-drenched streets of Tehran, you might have seen Israeli engineers walking with Persian architects. They were talking about water, oil, and the future. They were friends. It is difficult to imagine this today, isn't it? My friends, history is like a great, deep ocean. On the surface, the waves can be violent and loud, but deep below, there are currents that move slowly and change everything. These two nations, Iran and Israel, were once like two travelers walking the same path. They felt alone in a crowded neighborhood. They looked at each other and saw a reflection of their own struggles. They decided to walk together, keeping their friendship a quiet secret from the rest of the world. It was an alliance of necessity, built on the hard ground of survival. But what happens when the ground begins to shake? What happens when a friend becomes a stranger and a stranger becomes a ghost? Every story of conflict begins with a moment of choice. A leader signs a paper. A soldier follows an order. A citizen feels a new kind of anger in their heart. As we sit here by our fire tonight, we must ask ourselves, is the fire here to keep us warm, or is it here to burn what we have built? The story of Iran and Israel is not just about politics or land. It is a story about the human soul, about pride, fear, and the long memory of the desert. Are you ready to journey with me through these shadows? We will see the rise of kings and the fall of revolutions. We will witness the secret deals made in dark rooms and the public battles fought in the bright sun. This is a story of resilience, but it is also a story of a great loss. It is the story of how a hand, offered in friendship, slowly turned into a fist. Let us begin our walk through the halls of time, where the echoes of the past are still ringing in the present sky. My friends, to understand the present, we must look deeply into the past. Let us go back to a time when the desert air smelled of oil and the promise of a new age. Imagine the year 1953. The world was cold and divided between two great powers, but in the Middle East, a different story was being written. In Tehran, the Shah of Iran sat upon a throne made of gold and history. He was a man who looked toward the west with hungry eyes. He wanted factories, modern armies, and gleaming cities that reached for the clouds. At the same time, the young state of Israel was fighting to survive. It was a small nation surrounded by those who did not want it to exist. These two nations were like two strangers standing at the edge of a dark forest. They did not share a language, and they did not share a religion. But they shared a common fear. They both felt like outsiders in their own neighborhood. In the logic of politics, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This was the beginning of what historians call the peripheral doctrine. Israel looked past its immediate neighbors to find friends on the edges of the map. Iran was the perfect partner. Imagine a secret meeting in a quiet room in Tehran. There were no cameras, and there were no public announcements. Men in dark suits shook hands and spoke in low voices. They agreed to a deal that would change the region for decades. Iran had the one thing Israel needed more than anything else: oil. Without oil, a modern nation cannot breathe. In return, Israel offered something Iran craved: technology and intelligence. Israeli engineers traveled to the Iranian countryside. They taught farmers how to grow crops in the dry, cracked earth. They built dams and irrigation systems that turned brown fields into vibrant green. It was a golden age of cooperation, but it was a silent one. If you walked through the streets of Tehran in the 1960s, you would see the signs of this hidden friendship everywhere. You might see a brand new hospital equipped with the latest medical tools from Tel Aviv. You might hear the sound of Israeli construction equipment building the very foundations of the modern Iranian state. The two countries even built a secret pipeline together. It carried white gold, the oil that fueled the engines of progress. They were bound by a metal vein that stretched across the sand and under the sea. But even in the middle of this success, there was a shadow. The Shah was a king. But he was a king who lived in a glass palace. He knew that many of his people did not like this secret friendship. Most Iranians felt a deep sympathy for the people of the region who were struggling against Israel. The Shah had to walk a very thin line. He accepted the help, the oil money, and the weapons. But he kept the relationship hidden in the mists of time. It was a marriage of convenience, not of love. Think about the contrast in the city. On one side, there were the wealthy elites drinking French wine and talking about the future. On the other side, there were the crowded marketplaces and the quiet mosques. In those dark corners, a different kind of energy was growing. People felt that their culture was being sold for Western gadgets and secret alliances. They saw the Israeli advisors as symbols of a government that had lost its soul. The tension was like a heavy blanket over the city. You couldn't always see it, but you could always feel it. During this era, the Israeli intelligence agency, the Mossad, helped train the Shah's secret police. They wanted to ensure that the Shah stayed in power, because if he fell, the oil would stop flowing. This decision would later become a tragedy. The very tools used to protect the alliance were the tools that made the people hate it. Every time a protester was silenced, the anger grew deeper. The friendship was helping the Iranian state grow strong, but it was also helping the revolution grow loud. As we sit here by our fire, my friends, we must remember that history is never simple. Was the Shah right to seek security through a secret alliance? Was Israel right to trust a king whose throne was shaking? The era of the Silent Alliance was a time of great achievement, but it was built on a foundation of secrets. And as the sun began to set on the Shah's reign, those secrets were about to be dragged into the light. The sky was turning red, and the wind was starting to howl. The Golden Age was over, and the Age of Fire was about to begin. My friends, the air in the 1970s felt different. It was thicker, filled with the scent of change and the smoke of distant fires. Imagine the world as a house that looked strong on the outside, but the wood inside was slowly rotting. The alliance between Iran and Israel was still active, but the smiles in the official photographs were becoming stiff and cold. The two nations were like dancers who had been moving together for a long time, but now they were starting to step on each other's feet. In 1973, a great war broke out between Israel and its Arab neighbors. It was a moment of deep fear for the region. During this conflict, the world's oil supply was used as a weapon. The price of oil began to climb higher and higher, faster than anyone could have imagined. Suddenly, the Shah of Iran became one of the wealthiest and most powerful men on the planet. He was no longer a junior partner looking for protection. He felt like a titan, a king who could dictate terms to the rest of the world. Imagine the Shah sitting in his palace, surrounded by advisors and the finest things money could buy. He began to think that he didn't need Israel as much as he once did. He started to speak more loudly about the rights of other nations in the region. He wanted to be seen as a leader of the entire Islamic world, not just a friend of the West. This was a decision that sent a chill through the government offices in Tel Aviv. The mirror of their friendship was showing its first long, thin cracks. At the same time, the streets of Tehran were changing. The gap between the very rich and the very poor was growing into a deep canyon. Have you ever felt the tension in a room right before a storm breaks? That was Tehran in the mid-1970s. People were tired of the secret police, and they were tired of seeing their culture replaced by foreign ideas. They looked at the Israeli military advisors and saw them as part of the problem. They saw them as the hands that kept the Shah's iron grip tight on their throats. In small, crowded rooms and quiet university halls, people began to listen to tapes of a man in exile, Ayatollah Khomeini. He spoke about a different kind of power. He didn't talk about oil or tanks. He talked about the soul, justice, and the removal of foreign shadows. For the first time, the opposition to the Shah was not just about politics. It was about identity. The alliance with Israel, once a secret strength, was now a public target. Every 30 seconds, the world seemed to shift. There was a protest in one street, a strike in another factory. The Shah's response was always the same: more force. But force is like a fire. If you use too much of it, you eventually run out of things to burn. The Israeli government watched these events with growing worry. They realized that if the Shah fell, their most reliable friend in the East would vanish. They sent messages, they offered advice, but the tide of history was pulling the Shah away from the shore. One afternoon in 1978, the sound of chanting became so loud that it could be heard inside the royal palace. Independence, freedom, Islamic Republic. The people cried. The Shah looked out at his city and saw a sea of black and white. He realized that his gold and his guns could not buy the love of his people. He was a man out of time. The cracks in the mirror were no longer thin. The mirror was about to shatter into a million pieces. The first failure of the alliance was not a military one. It was a failure of understanding. The leaders had focused on the mechanics of power, the pipelines, the weapons, and the money. But they had forgotten the people. They had built a bridge over a river that was rapidly turning into a flood. As the year 1978 came to a close, the lights in the Israeli embassy in Tehran began to go dark, one by one. The staff began to pack their bags, listening to the roar of the crowds outside the gates. The moment of crisis was here. The world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when the glass finally broke. Would there be a way to save the friendship, or was the path ahead covered in thorns? My friends, we are standing at the edge of the great transformation. Take a deep breath with me. The fire is burning low, and the story is about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. My friends, imagine the sky over Tehran in early 1979. The air was thick with the smell of burning tires and the electric energy of a million voices. The world was witnessing an earthquake of the human spirit. The Shah, the man who had sat on the peacock throne for decades, finally boarded a plane and flew into the clouds, never to return. The silence he left behind was quickly filled by a roar that shook the very foundations of the Middle East. This was the lowest emotional moment for the old world order, a total collapse of everything that had been built over 30 years. On February 1st, a large airplane touched down at the airport. Out stepped Ayatollah Khomeini, a man who had been a ghost in the shadows of exile for 15 years. He did not come with flowers or promises of a quiet life. He came with a message that struck like a hammer against a bell. He declared that the era of foreign shadows was over. In his eyes, Israel was no longer a partner in progress. It was the little Satan, an enemy of the faith and the people. Imagine the scene at the Israeli embassy, a building that had once been a symbol of secret strength and cooperation. A mob of angry protesters gathered at the gates. They were not there to talk. They were there to tear down the symbols of the past. The Israeli flag, which had flown quietly for years, was ripped from the pole and burned in the street. The building was handed over to the leaders of the Palestinian movement. In one afternoon, the silent alliance was erased, replaced by a wall of fire and hatred. For the thousands of Israelis living in Iran, doctors, teachers, and business owners, the world turned upside down in a single day. They had to flee their homes with nothing but what they could carry. Imagine the fear in a mother's heart as she hurried her children to the airport, listening to the chants of the revolution outside. They were leaving behind friends, memories, and a life that had once felt permanent. This was not just a political shift. It was a human tragedy. The new government in Tehran made their position clear to the world. They cut all ties. They stopped the flow of oil. They turned the secret pipelines into cold, empty tunnels. The relationship had moved from a quiet handshake to a public war of words. The leaders in Tel Aviv watched the television screens in shock. They saw a nation they thought they knew transform into a stranger. They realized that the peripheral doctrine, their strategy for survival, had just become their greatest threat. But why did it happen so fast? Why did the friendship turn into such bitter enmity? My friends, it is because a revolution is like a flood. It seeks out every crack in the old system and pours through with unstoppable force. The alliance with Israel had become the primary symbol of the Shah's unholy connection to the West. To the revolutionaries, destroying that link was a way of purifying the nation's soul. This was the crisis that would define the rest of our story. The two nations were now like two ships passing in a storm, each seeing the other as a monster in the dark. There were no more secret phone calls. There were no more shared agricultural projects. There was only the sound of the wind and the growing distance between them. The transformation was complete. The era of cooperation was dead, and the era of the Shadow War was beginning. Take a moment to breathe with me by the fire. The story has become dark, and the road ahead is covered in shadows. But even in the deepest crisis, the human spirit continues to look for a way forward. The next chapter is not about peace, but about the strange and dangerous ways that enemies find themselves connected in the dark. Are you ready to see what happens when the logic of war takes over? My friends, the air was cold in the early 1980s, and the world was watching a terrible tragedy unfold. A long and bloody war had broken out between Iran and its neighbor, Iraq. It was a war of trenches, chemical weapons, and young men lost in the mud. Iran was isolated, alone, and desperately needed weapons to defend its borders. This was the moment of a strange and secret turning point. Even though the leaders in Tehran shouted angry words against Israel in public, the cold logic of survival was whispering a different story in the shadows. Imagine a secret meeting in a dimly lit office, far from the prying eyes of the press. The people in the room were enemies by day, but by night they were businessmen of war. Israel wanted to prevent an Iraqi victory, and Iran needed spare parts for its airplanes and tanks machines that had been bought back when the Shah was in power. This led to a series of hidden deals known as the Iran-Contra affair. It was a moment where the lines of history became blurred and messy. They were like two rivals who hated each other, yet found themselves sharing a weapon to fight a common monster in the dark. This was the decision to continue, but in a way that no one could have predicted. It was not a return to friendship. It was a desperate move for power. These secret flights carrying forbidden cargo showed that beneath the surface of religious ideology, the old rules of politics still existed. But secrets have a way of poisoning the ground. When the details of these deals began to leak out, the trust was shattered forever. The public anger in Iran grew even sharper to hide the shame of the secret contact. The two nations had reached the point where they could never go back to the way things were before. The turning point was not just about weapons. It was about a change in the soul of the conflict. Iran began to realize that it could not rely on anyone. It started to build its own path, creating a network of influence that reached across the desert toward the sea. They began to support groups in other countries, moving the battlefield away from their own borders and closer to the heart of their rival. The conflict was no longer a disagreement between two governments. It was becoming a struggle for the future of the entire region. In Israel, the realization was equally sharp. They saw that the revolution in Iran was not a passing storm, but a permanent change in the climate. They began to view Iran not just as a distant enemy, but as the primary threat to their existence. The silent alliance was truly dead, and in its place a shadow war was being born. Every move by one side led to a counter-move by the other. Like a game of chess where the pieces are made of fire and steel. As we sit by our fire, my friends, consider how strange history can be. The very war that should have kept them apart briefly brought them together in the shadows, only to push them further into hatred afterward. The bridge was gone, and the river was rising. The next stage of their journey would be one of long struggle and quiet discipline. Are you ready to see how a nation learns to fight when the whole world is watching? The years following the Great Transformation were not filled with loud explosions, but with a quiet and intense discipline. My friends, imagine a long dark hallway where you can hear footsteps, but you never see the person walking. This was the era of the Shadow War. Iran, now isolated from the Western world, realized it had to stand on its own feet. They began a journey of slow progress, building their own technology and their own strength from the dust of the desert. They turned their focus inward, training scientists and engineers to create what they could no longer buy from abroad. Every day was a test of resilience. In hidden laboratories and quiet mountain bases, the work continued for decades. It was a struggle of patience. While the rest of the world looked at the headlines, the real battle was happening in the details of science and the whispers of spies. The two nations were no longer fighting for land, but for influence over the mind of the region. Iran began to build a ring of fire, a network of friends and partners that stretched across many borders. They were creating a shield to protect their revolution. In Israel, the discipline was equally sharp. They lived in a state of constant readiness, always looking at the horizon for the next shadow. They built advanced systems that could see through the dark and stop threats before they reached the city gates. This was the era of the war between wars. It was a series of small, precise actions designed to slow down the enemy without starting a full-scale fire. The struggle became a part of the rhythm of life. Children grow up knowing that the sky was protected by invisible walls of technology. The struggle also moved into a place no one could see, the digital world. Imagine a war where no soldiers move and no guns fire, yet power plants stop and secrets disappear. This was the birth of cyber warfare. A single line of code became as dangerous as 1,000 tanks. Both nations became masters of this new art, attacking and defending in the silent space of computers. It was a discovery that changed the nature of conflict forever. They were two masters of a dark craft, locked in a battle where the winner is the one who never sleeps. Through these long years, the memory of the old alliance faded like a photograph left in the sun. A new generation grew up in both countries who had never known a time of friendship. To them, the other side was not a former partner, but a permanent monster. This was the tragedy of the long struggle. The discipline required to fight a war often requires you to forget that the enemy is a human being. The contrast between the rich history they shared and the cold reality of the present grew deeper every year. The struggle was slow, and the progress was measured in inches, not miles. But the tension was always building. Like a rubber band being pulled tighter and tighter, everyone knew that eventually something would have to give. The world watched as the two rivals grew stronger, more disciplined, and more dangerous. They were preparing for a moment that they both feared and expected. The shadows were growing long, and the era of the long struggle was reaching its peak. Take a moment to look at the fire with me, my friends. The path we are walking is difficult, but it is important to see the truth. The long struggle is a story of what happens when fear becomes a way of life. But even in the middle of a struggle, there is a search for meaning. Are you ready to see the moment where the shadow war finally steps into the light? My friends, we have reached the modern day, the era where the long-hidden shadow war finally stepped into the blinding light of the world's attention. In recent years, the struggle has moved from the whispers of spies to the roar of machines. The breakthroughs in technology have made the world feel smaller and more dangerous than ever before. We have witnessed moments that once seemed impossible, direct strikes and public threats that have changed the rules of the game forever. This is the stage of recognition, where both nations have achieved a level of power that forces the entire globe to watch with a held breath. The breakthrough of this era is not one of peace, but of a terrifying new capability. Iran, through decades of discipline and secret work, achieved a reach that transformed the geography of the region. They built long-range machines that can cross thousands of miles of desert in a matter of minutes. These are not just weapons, they are symbols of a nation that refuses to be ignored. In Israel, the breakthrough was equally dramatic. They perfected the Iron Dome and other advanced systems that can catch fire in the sky. It is a world where machines fight machines, while the people below look up and wonder if the stars are still there. Public attention is now constant. Every movement of a ship in the Gulf or a plane in the sky is reported in real time. We're living in the most public era of this long and private war. The secrecy of the past has been replaced by the high-stakes drama of the present. A single mistake, a single misstanding in the dark, could now start a global disaster. The recognition of this danger has forced other nations to choose sides, creating new alliances that shift like the sand dunes we spoke of before. Imagine the intensity of a command center during a modern crisis. The screens are filled with maps, data, and thermal images. There is no room for error. The achievement of this level of military power has changed the way these two rivals see each other. They no longer look for a way to win. They look for a way to survive the other's strength. It is a breakthrough of tension, a peak in the mountain range of history that offers a view of a very dangerous horizon. But even with this public recognition, the human cost remains hidden in the shadows. The achievement of power has not brought the sense of security that the leaders promised their people. Instead, it has created a world of constant readiness and anxiety. The contrast between the high-tech weapons and the ancient lands they fly over is a reminder of how little we have truly progressed. We have achieved the power to destroy, but we are still searching for the wisdom to build. As we sit here, the history is still being written. The breakthrough has revealed the true depth of the divide, a canyon that seems too wide to cross. But every peak is followed by a valley, and every storm eventually runs out of rain. The recognition of the current danger is the first step toward finding a different path. Are you ready for the final part of our journey, where we look for the meaning behind the fire? My friends, we have traveled through many decades tonight, watching the fire of this history rise and fall. We have seen how two nations, once secret partners, became the most bitter of rivals. Now, as the embers of our own fire begin to glow softly, it is time to look for the meaning behind the struggle. What does it tell us about the human spirit and the world we share? The first lesson is that history is not a straight line. It is a circle of choices. The conflict between Iran and Israel is a reminder of how quickly the world can change when fear and pride take the lead. We see that power, while necessary for survival, does not always bring peace. Both nations have achieved incredible things in science and defense, yet they live in a state of constant anxiety. True resilience, as we have seen in the stories of the ordinary people in Tehran and Tel Aviv, is not found in the strength of machines, but in the ability to endure and the hope for a different tomorrow. There is also a deep philosophical insight in the fact that these two cultures share so much. Both have roots that go back thousands of years to the dawn of civilization. They have both contributed art, poetry, and wisdom to the world. The tragedy of their conflict is a reflection of the shadow within us, all the part of the human soul that projects its own fears onto the other. When we stop seeing the human being behind the enemy's mask, we lose a piece of our own humanity. As you listen to the quiet of the night, think about the bridges that were burned. A bridge is a fragile thing, but it is the only way to cross a canyon of hatred. The history of these two lands tells us that peace is not just the absence of war, it is the presence of understanding. It is the courage to remember the time when engineers and farmers worked together and the wisdom to believe it could happen again. Take a deep breath and let the tension of the story fade away. You are safe here by the fire. The world is complex and often dark, but your search for knowledge is a light of its own. By learning this history, you are connecting yourself to the global human story. You are becoming a person who looks for the truth instead of just the headlines. Thank you for sitting with me tonight, my friends. We have walked through the mists of time together, and I hope you feel a little closer to the world than you did before. The night is long, but the morning always comes. Keep these stories in your heart, for they are the maps that help us find our way. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and keep dreaming. This script is based on real historical research, using sources from the Encyclopedia Britannica, the BBC History Archives, and academic journals on Middle Eastern geopolitics. Some dialogue and emotional details have been reconstructed based on survivor accounts and academic research. The purpose of this video is not to glorify war, but to honor human sacrifice and courage on all sides.